She's got to watch. If folks will take their seats, we'll bring our hearing to order. I want to thank all our participants for being here. The hearing will now come to order. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing in investigating federal oil spill research and development. Our hearing today provides us with an opportunity to examine current federal R&D efforts to prevent, detect, or mitigate oil discharges. In addition, the subcommittee will receive testimony on new legislation introduced by Representative Woolsey entitled the Federal Oil Spill Research Program Act of 2009. As a co-sponsor of the legislation, I want to thank Ms. Woolsey for her dedication to this important issue. The Exxon Valdez disaster of 1989 provided the impetus for the passage of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, also known as OPA 90, which expanded the oil prevention, preparedness, and response capacity of the federal government and industry. OPA 90 has been a success story in many ways. However, new challenges exist today that were not apparent when the bill was authorized. Although oil leaked from tankers has vastly decreased, oil spills from other vessels and from on-land sources remain high. In 2007, a 900-foot container ship, the Costco Busan, struck the San Francisco Bay Bridge, spilling over 50,000 gallons of oil into the bay. That accident has brought renewed attention and focus to current federal government procedures, practices, and research. Following that event and other recent accidents, it's clear that the United States needs a more robust research and development strategy to reduce the environmental and economic impacts of oil spills. Currently, responders face increasing challenges arising from an increase in maritime transportation, potential for onshore energy exploration in remote locations, aging infrastructure, and new fuel stocks and blends. Title VII of OPA 90 created an interagency oil spill research and development program with the goal of coordinating federal research to encourage the development of new technologies to address oil spills. Despite the Interagency Committee's detailed research plan, there have been modest technological advances in oil spill cleanup technologies since the enactment of the law in 1990. According to the Committee on Maritime Transportation of Heavy Oils, most oil spills experience a 10 to 15% rate of recovery. More recent estimates have reported an increase in recovery rates to 40% in best-case scenarios. Given, however, that these low recovery percentages, additional research and development is necessary to reach acceptable levels of mitigation. The Federal Oil Spill Research Program Act, authored by Ms. Woolsey, seeks to reorient the current federal interagency research and development program created in OPA. The legislation would improve the federal government's research and development efforts to prevent, detect, or mitigate oil discharges. The bill provides a new direction to the existing program by guiding research towards new challenges and making interagency structures for this program more efficient. Through this reauthorization, the responsible federal agencies will be better equipped to quickly and effectively respond to oil discharges both inland and in coastal waters. We have an excellent panel of witnesses with us this morning who will share their views on oil spill responses, recovery, and mitigation. I thank you all for being with us here today, and I look forward to your suggestions relating to the Federal Oil Spill Research Act. And we have been joined at this point by the author of the proposed legislation, Ms. Woolsey. And Ms. Woolsey, I've been singing your praises in your absence, and will do so again throughout today's hearing. At this point, I would like to yield time to Representative Woolsey, and then in one moment I'll recognize Mr. Inglis. Ms. Woolsey.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member and panel for being here to talk about something that's very important to me and holding this hearing, and also for allowing me to make an opening statement. Oil spill prevention and mitigation is important to me, not only because I think it's vital to protect the environment and our coastal economies, but also because my district has been seriously affected by what many consider a minor spill. Well, As a result of this, I've been witness to how difficult an oil spill cleanup effort can be, even with the best available technology. As some of you remember, on November 7th, 2007, the container ship Costco Busan collided with the San Francisco Bay Bridge and released 58,000 gallons of oil into San Francisco Bay. Because of the complex tidal mechanics that are present in the bay, the spill spread rapidly and quickly affected a large area of the north coast. including the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, the Point Reyes National Seashore, and both the Gulf of the Farallones and Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuaries. The pristine beaches of Marin County were soiled, waters off our federal parklands were sullied, and important restoration projects in Richardson and San Pablo Bay were threatened. In addition, the spill killed thousands of birds, many marine mammals, and no one knows how many fish. And I can't help but think that this oil spill played at least some part in the closure of the Sacramento River salmon fishery that migrates through the San Francisco Bay on their way out to sea. All in all, about 200 miles of coastline were affected by this one minor spill. That's why I've introduced H.R. 2693, the Federal Oil Spill Research Program Act. This bill coordinates federal research and development of oil spill prevention, detection, recovery, and mitigation to ensure that all the relevant agencies are working together for common solutions. In addition, the bill provides grants to institutes of higher learning and research centers to improve technologies that can be used to prevent, combat, and clean up oil spills. One thing that I heard again and again from the people who were tasked with cleaning up our mess was that the technology they were using just wasn't adequate to get the job done. Actually, of the 58,000 gallons of oil that were spilled into San Francisco Bay, only a little more than 40% of that amount was recovered. It's clear that current technology is inadequate to prevent and protect us from oil spills if we can only recover such a small percentage with what's available to us today. I know that the right focus and with the right focus and effort, we can do much, much better. And I'm hoping that H.R. 2693 will help to ensure that we will take an active role to prevent oil spills and do what and that when they do occur, we have the best possible technology to minimize negative impacts. So again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me spout off. I'm really proud that we're introducing this legislation, and we will hear from these great witnesses. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to do so, Ms. Woolsey. Your passion for the issue comes through both in your words today and many of your actions as a member of Congress over the many years, but also in the context of this legislation. I am now pleased to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Inglis, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. In many ways, this hearing is an opportunity to applaud the progress and success of NOAA, the U.S. Coast Guard, research labs, and environmental organizations at the state, federal, and local level, who have all contributed to a steady decline in oil spill incidents in our nation. This achievement is especially noteworthy considering that our annual transport of oil and other hazardous materials is not decreasing, but growing, rather, at a rapid pace. So thank you to the witnesses here for your hard work and for the work of those you represent in protecting our waters, wildlife, and ecological systems in the incidents of spills. But oil spills are one of those areas where we are as a country, will stop being worried when we're perfect. And since we're probably never going to be perfect or able to prevent any imaginable accident, we're here to discuss how we can readdress our strategies and resources for mitigating the impacts of oil spills. The 50,000-gallon spill in November of 2007 in the San Francisco Bay Area was a reminder that even small spills can be very costly. If there are ways that we can be promoting research and development to improve response and cleanup while driving down the cost of those efforts, we have a responsibility to encourage that research. I appreciate Congresswoman Woolsey's proactive efforts to bring legislation before this subcommittee, and I look forward to hearing our witnesses' thoughts on this bill. I'm especially interested to hear what deficiencies exist in the current interagency coordination efforts and if new legislation is necessary to correct these shortcomings. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. If there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. I want to thank Mr. Lujan for being here as well. Though not a coastal state per se, we very much appreciate your input and participation. Thank you very, very much. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our witnesses at this time. Mr. Doug Helton is the Incident Operations Coordinator at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of Response and Restoration. Dr. Albert D. Venosa is the Director of the Land Remediation and Pollution Control Division of the National Risk Management Research Laboratory, a part of the Office of Research and Development at EPA. Rear Admiral James Watson is the Director of Prevention Policy for Marine Safety, Security, and Stewardship for the U.S. Coast Guard. As I serve on the Coast Guard Committee subcommittee as well, it's a pleasure to see you in this committee, Admiral Watson. We'll try to invite you more frequently on other topics as well. And at this point, I'm happy again to yield to Ms. Woolsey to introduce our fourth witness, her fellow Californian, Mr. Edinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Edinger as a witness before our committee today. Mr. Edinger is the administrator for the California Department of Fish and Game, Office of Spill Prevention and Response. That probably took up more time than all of yours together. Am I just saying that? He is a graduate of the University of California, Davis, and was appointed as administrator by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in November 2008. He spent his professional career protecting California's wildlife and natural environments, serving over 28 years in environmental law enforcement. Mr. Edinger has investigated or served as the incident commander on hundreds of pollution events across California, most relevant to this hearing. He served as California's incident commander during the Costco-Busan oil spill response in November 2007. We look forward to hearing from you, Stephen.
As our witnesses know, we spoke briefly before the hearing began. You'll have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. I always have to apologize for that. You spend your entire careers on this, fly a long distance, and we give you 5 minutes. To make up for that, we'll ask you inane questions following your comments, and that should extend your opportunity to answer with something more substantive. Your written testimony, don't write that down, I'm saying to our It's not far from true, regrettably, occasionally. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you've completed your spoken testimony, we'll each begin with questions. We'll start with Mr. Helton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to talk about NOAA's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's role in oil spill pollution response, research and development. My name is Doug Helton. I'm the Incident Operations Coordinator for NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration. During spills, I helped to manage NOAA's emergency response efforts, including our roles as a scientific advisor to the U.S. Coast Guard or other federal on-scene coordinators responsible for the containment and the response and cleanup of the spill. Our marine transportation system is an integral part of the U.S. economy, but that transportation brings risks. Tank vessels loaded with large quantities of oil, up to 50 million gallons, transit our waters every day. And tankers and barges are not the only risk. There's also large cruise ships, freighters, container ships, workboats, coastal pipelines, storage facilities, and offshore oil exploration that also pose risks. Oil spills can cause widespread environmental, economic, and social impacts. The best course of action is to prevent these spills. However, despite our best efforts, there are still thousands of spills every year. Most are small, but the DM 932 barge spill in the Mississippi River last year is a reminder that large spills still occur, and the Costco-Busan incident in 2007 is a reminder that even small spills can cause significant impacts. We need to be prepared to reduce these impacts. NOAA provides products and services critical for making science-based response decisions that prevent further harm, restore natural resources, and promote effective planning for future incidents. Once oil is spilled, our goal is to advise the Coast Guard on the potential fate and impacts of the spill and to coordinate any scientific issues that arise during the response. Last year, my office was called 169 times for such support. In addition to our response role, NOAA is also a natural resource trustee for marine resources under the Oil Pollution Act, and we're responsible for ensuring that there's restoration that occurs after these spills. Strong science is critical to effective decision-making during spill response and restoration, and a robust R&D program can improve how we respond. Congress recognized this need by creating the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Oil Pollution as part of the Oil Pollution Act. While some funding has been provided over the years, the comprehensive research and development that was envisioned by the Oil Pollution Act has not been achieved, and research has actually declined in recent years. While research has produced advancements, and especially in technologies to prevent spills, the response community essentially has the same tools we had 20 years ago during the Exxon Valdez spill. The Oil Pollution Act gives NOAA authority to do research and development, and NOAA's most recent efforts in this regards were through a partnership with the University of New Hampshire's Coastal Response Research Center. That research focused on trade-offs of response technologies, including dispersants and burning, deep water well blowouts, Arctic and cold water spills, submerged oil, restoration science, modeling and information management, and the social dimensions of spills. In a few short years, the CRC has become a focal point for coordination and planning for oil spill research and development. And while these efforts have been beneficial, there's much additional research that's needed. We need to improve the capabilities for response and restoration in cold water and Arctic spills. Increasing vessel traffic and exploration will increase the potential for oil spills in the Arctic, and many of the standard approaches we have now do not work in Arctic waters. There's also a need to develop restoration and assessment technologies for these sensitive resources. We need improved oil spill modeling. We currently lack the modeling capability to determine how oil will behave when it sinks, how it behaves in icy environments or when it sinks below the surface. Understanding the behavior of oil in the water column is important for a number of reasons, including protecting water intakes and evaluating the effects on fisheries. For example, in 2004, the Athos 1 oil spill in Delaware River had a neutrally buoyant oil. That oil was entrained in the Salem nuclear power plant's water intakes and resulted in the precautionary closure of that power plant. Better understanding of how that submerged oil would behave would have been important in helping to reduce that closure, which was millions of dollars a day in losses. We need to better use remote sensing technologies, including unmanned aerial vehicles, real-time ocean observation systems. NOAA's trajectory modeling can help direct oil spill responders where the oil is heaviest, but using remote sensing would help us direct that cleanup technology more effectively. We also need a better understanding of the effects of residual oil. We know that from experience, residual oil can persist for a long time in the environment. We need to know the trade-offs associated with leaving that oil in place. And finally, we need to address the human and social dimensions of spill response. The success of a response is partly dependent upon how well the local community is engaged. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues, and I'll stand by to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Helton. Dr. Venosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Albert Venosa, Director of Office of Research and Development's Land Remediation and Pollution Control Division in National Risk Management Research Lab in Cincinnati. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss EPA's oil spill research program, its past accomplishments, and its future research plans. I've been with the agency for over 40 years, and for the last 20, I've led EPA's oil spill research and development program. Its objective is to provide environmental managers with tools, models, and methods needed to mitigate the effects of oil spills in all ecosystems, with emphasis in the inland environment. The research includes development of practical solutions to mitigate spill impacts on freshwater and marine environments, development and publication of remedial guidance for cleanup and restoration of oil-impacted environments, and determination of the fate and effects of oil contamination in the environment through effective modeling of oil transport in a variety of settings, especially river networks. So why does oil spill research need to be continued? The major source of inland oil spills in the U.S. is from ruptured pipelines and above-ground storage tanks, ASTs. Although larger oil spills from ocean-going tanker accidents have been on the decline over the last several decades, I believe that the number of inland oil spills may actually increase due to the greater emphasis on domestic oil production and higher volume generation of alternative fuels such as biofuels, which will be stored in ASTs. So the spill threat continues even without consideration of domestic alternative fuel development. Little is known about the effect of spills of biodiesel, emerging biofuels, or byproducts from their manufacture on watersheds. So consequently, research is needed to continue to find effective ways to respond not only to traditional petroleum spills, but also to spills of non-traditional alternative fuels and fuel blends. EPA's past research has resulted in new protocols for testing the effectiveness of commercial oil spill treating agents, guidance documents for implementing bioremediation in different environments, a clearer understanding of the impact and persistence of non-petroleum oil spills in the environment, and development of new spill treatment approaches. 10 years ago, we began conducting research on non-petroleum oils, such as vegetable oils and animal fats. This anticipatory research investment will be invaluable as the national emphasis on fuels development gains traction. Why? Because vegetable oils and animal fats are the primary feedstocks for biodiesel production. Contrary to some claims, our research has shown that edible oils are not as biodegradable as sugar in the environment because of the complexity of chemical interactions along saturated and unsaturated fatty acids. The future research that we'll do will involve the study of multiple fuel types and blends resulting from passage of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. Last year, in anticipation of this, we initiated the study of different types of biodiesel and biodiesel petrodiesel blends. An important byproduct in the production of biodiesel is glycerin, and we need to understand how to deal with glycerin spills in flowing streams because they've already resulted in large fish kills in several of our regions. As for Arctic spills, next year EPA plans to partner with the Canadian government to conduct both pilot and field-scale research, dispersant research in icy waters. Protection of this environment will become more critical as global climate change affects the integrity of the glacial ice fields in the Arctic. So in conclusion then, EPA's oil spill research program is an applied practical program based on high-quality sound science. It promises to provide answers to real and important emergency spill response and environmental protection challenges, especially in the area of emerging alternative fuel sources. Our research informs EPA regulatory decision-making and policy development for oil spill prevention, preparedness, and response programs. In the 20 years I've led this program, we've published over 85 peer-reviewed journal articles, 3 guidance documents, and 79 conference proceedings. So it's been a pretty productive and successful program both nationally and internationally. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Good afternoon, Chairman Baird and distinguished members of the committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify before this committee on the subject of federal oil spill research and development. The Coast Guard has been the lead federal agency for coastal zone oil and hazmat response since 1968, and I've been personally involved with oil and hazmat prevention and response my entire Coast Guard career. As an engineer and first responder, I value research and development. In the area of maritime pollution prevention and response in particular, R&D has been a major factor in reducing both the number of major oil incidents and the quantities left in the environment after an accident. For example, the annual number of oil spills greater than 100 gallons has decreased from over 300 per year to less than 100 since 1996. Simultaneously, recovery rates, which are historically less than 15%, are improving. Today, we're recovering as much as 3 times the historic rate due to better planning, more response capacity, and better projections and recovery equipment. I attribute many of these improvements to the collective efforts of government agencies and industry following the passage of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. Open 90 created an integrated team-based approach which successfully leveraged the federal on-scene coordinator leadership attributes of the Coast Guard and the EPA at both the national and local level, as well as the technical and scientific capabilities of NOAA, the Minerals Management Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Navy, state and environmental agencies, and universities nationwide. The Coast Guard's own Research and Development Center, which just recently moved from Groton, Connecticut to New London, Connecticut, has been included in the collective R&D effort since well before 1990 and continues to be productive in oil and hazmat R&D. While EPA tends to focus on toxicity and NOAA on oil behavior and impacts and MMS on offshore blowouts, for example, Coast Guard's R&D is currently focused on sensors for aircraft, recovery of submerged oil, and oil and ice, and decision-making tools for the responders. This distribution of labor for R&D is being monitored and reported to Congress in accordance with Section 7001 of OPA 90, which established the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Oil Pollution Research. The Coast Guard chairs this interagency committee and provides the biennial report to Congress. Coast Guard personnel must stay closely plugged in to the various R&D facilities, conferences, and publications to fulfill their duty. But speaking as a federal on-scene coordinator myself and as a beneficiary of these collective R&D efforts, I can tell you the benefits have far exceeded the cost of participating with this interagency R&D effort. We estimate that a recovery capability increase of 10% would have saved over $1 billion in response and environmental damage based on the cost figures since 1992. Despite past successes, much more R&D is needed. We are just beginning to understand and solve the challenges of submerged oil, oil and ice, dispersed oil, oil and fast currents, and biofuels in water. We are pleased to see other nations and even the maritime industry taking on these challenges. For example, Norway is conducting a major oil and ice analysis, and oil companies are engaged with Coast Guard engineers in the conceptual stages for high-latitude prevention and response capabilities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'll be happy to take your questions.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today regarding California's experience and perspective on the status of oil spill response technologies. I'm the administrator of the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, also known as OSPR. I oversee more than 200 employees dedicated to protecting California's habitats and wildlife from the devastating effects of pollution. OSPR was established by the Lemperkeen Sea Strand Oil Spill Prevention and Response Act of 1990, following the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 and the oil trader spill in Southern California in 1990. OSPR is one of the few state-level entities in the nation that has both major pollution response authority and public trustee authority for wildlife and habitat. OSPR has a legislative mandate to ensure that California's natural resources receive the best protection through oil spill prevention, preparedness, response, and restoration. I'm required to consider using processes that are currently in use anywhere in the world to obtain the best achievable technology. Today, I will share some of my observations from the November 7th motor vessel Costco Busan oil spill in San Francisco Bay. I will emphasize some of the gaps in the oil spill technologies that remain. I will highlight some of the effective oil spill technologies utilized by OSPR that were developed as a result of the enactment of state and federal oil spill legislation. On the morning of November 7th, 2007, the motor vessel Costco Busan, a 900-foot container ship, departed the Port of Oakland with visibility estimated at less than 1/4 nautical mile. The Costco Busan alighted with one of the towers of the San Francisco Bay Bridge, resulting in the breach of 3 tanks, spilling 53,000 gallons of bunker fuel into San Francisco Bay. In the following weeks, 43% of the oil spilled into the bay was recovered. While the response to the Costco Busan oil spill was a success, improvements in current technologies could have increased recovery of oil and protection of the environment. 2 technologies that might have increased oil recovery include oil detection during reduced visibility or nighttime conditions, and oil containment in high-velocity environments. Oil recovery is hampered during times of reduced visibility. As demonstrated during the Costco Busan response, fog hindered accurate trajectory analysis and on-the-water recovery. We lack a critical tool to detect concentrations of oil during periods of restricted visibility. About booming, conventional containment and exclusion booms begin to fail when currents exceed 3/4 of a knot. We need a deployable boom that operates effectively in complex, high-velocity currents that are frequently encountered in the coastal environments. While I mentioned 2 technologies that need improvement, there are examples of emerging technologies utilized by OSPR. One is multispectral and thermal imaging. This imaging technology uses a combination of sensors to capture imagery from wavelengths outside of the human visible light range. This imaging system has enabled rapid oil spill mapping and far greater quantitative and geographical accuracy that was possible using only visual observations. Another is high-frequency radar surface current monitoring. Along the California coastline, high-frequency radar stations record ocean currents. Surface current data were used extensively during the Costco-Busan response to create trajectories using real-time conditions. These trajectories aided in the identification and protection of environmentally sensitive sites at risk. About our role in federal research and development, we would support a continued and increased role with respect to identification of research priorities and practical application of new methods and technologies. In conclusion, OSPR and the state of California recognize the need for continued improvement in the prevention and response to oil spills. OSPR is committed to utilizing the best achievable technologies as required by statute to provide for the best achievable protection of the marine environment. We support federal research efforts to provide or to improve and develop technologies that address these issues. Again, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address this subcommittee. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Edinger. At this point, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. We've been joined, by the way, by Mr. Davis and Ms. Edwards. Thank you both for joining us. You know, one of the things that tends to happen to all of us, I suppose, is that when there's a big crisis, a massive spill, Exxon Valdez, we scramble jets, create legislation, we all respond. And then there's a natural sort of decline in focus, maybe. And I want to address that a little bit. Mr. Helton, you talked in your testimony a little bit, at least in the written testimony, about that the comprehensive research, and this is a quote, comprehensive research and development envisioned by OPA has not been fully achieved. What needs to happen to make that happen, to make the vision a reality?
I would say that the agencies are working together to try to fulfill that vision. Resources are a limitation. That's a consideration. I think that the plans are there. It just needs to be implemented.
Following up on that, OPA 90 created a coordinating committee on oil pollution research. What's the status of that committee? Does it, to the best knowledge of anybody on the panel, does it meet regularly? Does it produce documents? Does it analyze effectiveness, or what's the status of that?
Yes, sir. It does meet. It works primarily through an ongoing amount of activity at conferences. There's research activity going on at the various laboratories, and I think that there's a constant communication between the various scientists. And then every 2 years, there's a report that's compiled and submitted to Congress of all of the different activities, and these are categorized in the various different areas that help oil spill responders. In some cases, it's the surveillance equipment. Other cases, it's the recovery equipment, the modeling of oil in the water, the fate analysis of different types of oil over time in the water column, and so on. So. I think one of the main intents of that was to make sure there's not duplication of effort and to make sure that there's dialogue, and I think those two things are happening. Can that committee be taken to another level? I think it could be. I think actually if you look backwards in time, you'll see that at one time it was involved with grants to states and universities, for example. It spent a lot more money out of the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund for research and development. Some of those things are a function of appropriation. Some of it was a sort of a ending of the authority, for example, for the grants and the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund expenditures.
That trust fund predominantly is designed, as my understanding, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, to help fund the cleanup operation. Does it also fund the research side of it?
Yes, sir, it has in the past. I think, I don't know the big number of all of the dollars spent on research out of the fund. I do know since its inception, the fund has provided approximately $51 million to the Coast Guard's R&D program. And that's how we develop things like the vessel of opportunity skimming system and the skimming system that we have built into our buoy tenders so that they're ready at any time for an oil spill, and all sorts of different things. The pump that was used on the new Carissa to get the very viscous oil out of that hull while it lay on the beach there in Oregon, I believe. And so,
Right off our coast, actually.
yes, sir. So these were some of the outcomes of R&D, and I'm sure a lot of that was due to the fund.
But there may be a need to revisit that issue of whether or not that fund is still adequately contributing to ongoing research. Apparently for a time it functioned, and there at least seems to be a bit of a question mark about whether or not a sufficient portion of that fund is actually going to fund the research. Is that a fair portrayal, or Dr. Venosa?
Yes, I think it is. I think the resources, I don't want to sound like a scientist who's begging for money, but I think the
That never happens before
No,
this
we never do
committee,
that. But the resources help. My budget has been about $500,000 per year for the last 20 years. We've got, as I said, we've got a lot of publications out of it, but $500,000 doesn't go very far. And in fact, a lab study that 15 years ago cost $60,000 to $80,000 now costs $130,000. So really, the budget has actually gone down.
Yeah, I guess
inflation.
I want to close out with really two questions, and maybe we may pursue them later if we have another round. One is the degree to which folks like Admiral Watson, Mr. Edinger, who are out there on the ground, more likely in the water, I should say, trying to clean up the spills. You've each given some examples, and there's mention by Mr. Helton about dealing with cold water situations. But one of my fundamental questions would be, to what extent and through what mechanisms does the real-world practitioner who says, gosh, if only we had a way to see where the darn oil is in the fog or at night, or to suck up viscous material, or to deal with cold water, to what extent does that drive the research? Where's that nexus? That's one question. And then related to that is, let's suppose you do drive the research. Where's the financial incentive? This strikes me as a little bit like the problem we have with funding for pharmaceuticals to deal with rare disease outbreaks. All the incentives are in the wrong direction. Why should a drug company invest a significant amount of money for something that may never get to be used? If they do use it, they could get sued, et cetera. And separately, I've worked on that issue. But here, where is the incentive? Let's suppose Mr. Edinger says, look, I've got to get something that helps me identify where oil is at night. Where's the financial incentive for some company to invest in producing the products that allow you to do that? And similarly, let's suppose there's a need for a more viscous pump. Or that would be a second question. We don't have time to deal with it in this round, but I hope maybe we can get to that. I'll recognize Mr. Inglis for 5 minutes at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Chairman was just asking the question about the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 and the Interagency Coordinating Committee. I wonder if anybody wants to comment on how it could be improved. I assume things are always subject to improvement, and if we approach it in a process way and say, you know, what could be really better about what was called for in that act, and driving things along. Any thoughts about what you'd like to see if you had a wish list of things that you could ask Congress and Congress would do it? What would that be?
That's a dangerous question.
Well, we have a number of areas that we believe would be fruitful for research. I think the question is not necessarily the structure of the organizational committee as much as what resources that they have to take new research, especially the areas I mentioned. There's a lot of new technologies that are available that we're not applying towards oil spills. We're not using some of the remote sensing. We're not using some of the unmanned aerial vehicles, things like that are out there in industry now in other areas. Some of those areas need more research on how they can be applied. On the question of the nexus on research and how we make sure that research is appropriate, that the people in the field actually get their ideas to the scientists. The structure of the research that NOAA's done with the University of New Hampshire is actually intentionally designed that way. Every research project has an assigned field responder whose who has expertise in that area from a field perspective to make sure that the research is providing information that's useful to the responders.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, EPA gets its research ideas, so to speak, from interactions with the program office, the Office of Emergency Management, because they deal with the on-scene coordinators on a daily basis, and they know what where the needs for inland oil spills are. And so I have almost a daily discussion with the OEM folks about research and what can we do to solve the problems that the on-scene coordinators are facing within our agency. And that's basically where we get our ideas for research, through interactions with the program office and the on-scene coordinators. The Admiral talked about the Interagency Coordinating Committee, and I'd like to say that I think it has worked very, in fact, one of the ways that we do interact, and he didn't mention, is through the Science and Technology Committee, which is a committee of the National Response Team. And the people who are compose the Interagency Coordinating Committee are also on that Science and Technology Committee. We meet on a monthly basis through conference call, and we talk. All of us talk about the research that we're doing. So we do communicate, we do collaborate, and we do coordinate. Perhaps we haven't been as good about reporting to Congress as much as we should, but at least we do what we're supposed to be doing in terms of the directive.
So I'd like to echo Dr. Venosa. I think that the system is working pretty good as far as having an ear toward the responder. I mean, both the Coast Guard and EPA are the responders, and we're certainly very involved with that interagency committee and feeding those needs directly to the research facilities and the researchers. I think one thing that, and you touched on it, Chairman Baird, maybe coming up with some better incentives for companies, for the private sector, to be involved. Now, we try to stay involved, and actually I'm very complimentary about a number of privately funded research activities, but that's a little less organized. It's not maybe as robust as it could be, or as led as well as it might be by the federal agencies on this committee. There's also the international efforts, and again, we try to be as involved as possible. The United States is seen as the world leader, and maybe this committee could have even a better leadership role if it was a little emphasis there.
Ranking Member, regarding participation by state, local entities, certainly we want to continue to participate in this process. In California, we don't necessarily do the research, but we apply the research that's done or funded by the federal government. So research certainly is very important to us. As far as financial incentive, I think we could look once again to the Costco Busan, which is as Representative Woolsey said, maybe not that large of a size of a spill, but certainly significant in the response. Response costs are going to end up somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 per gallon for a product spilled. So there is a financial incentive out there. In addition, in California, we have a regulatory structure that requires best achievable technology by the industry. The industry is required to use what is the best achievable technology. Similar to what the federal government does, we have a work group together that includes federal government, includes state, includes non-government organizations, looking at the different technologies and deciding which is the best achievable technology. But there is a financial incentive, certainly, for companies to develop new technologies and for the industry to use those during an event.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lujan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And Dr. Venosa, if I could begin with something that you said in your opening remarks about some of the concerns that you did have with support that may be needed to also address inland spills. I know that the overlying reason that we're here is some of the concerns that have occurred on our coast, but you brought up a point there that caught my interest, and if you could talk about that a little bit more, and then to hear from each of you to your experiences or how maybe Mr. Helton or Admiral Watson or Mr. Edinger, with your experience in California responsibilities, both coastal and inland, on what can be learned from there, so that way we're making sure that we're looking at the entire country for preparedness here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in the area of inland spills, and this is my opinion, but I think, and I said that we're probably going to have more spills rather than fewer as we change our emphasis in the future to biofuels development. I think you're going to, since all these biofuels are going to be transported by pipeline and they're going to be stored in above ground storage tanks, I think you're going to see that those pipelines do corrode, and so do the above ground storage tanks. You're going to see more and more of these spills as we increase the volume production of biofuels in the future. And so I think we need to start conducting research to try to, how do we deal with those new spills? These are new things to us. We've been doing research for 10 years on vegetable oils. We know a lot about vegetable oils and how they persist in the environment and how they're treated biologically. But we don't know enough yet. And with biofuels, they're slightly different from the vegetable oil feedstocks. We don't know that much about them at all yet, nor do we know anything about animal fats. I think you're going to see a lot more of those being produced as well as being spilled.
Thank you, Mr. Lujan. My agency's primary focus is ocean and coastal resources, but we do support inland spills and work in the Great Lakes as well. We have all the inland rivers we provide scientific support on. Next week is the 10th anniversary of the Olympic pipeline spill in Washington State, which is one of the spills I worked on. That was 250,000 gallons of gasoline that was spilled into a coastal stream and caught fire and caused several fatalities, as well as destroying a city park. And so NOAA's involved in those level of incidents as well, and certainly something we try to remind our audience that we're not just talking about the large tanker accidents, that these can happen in any community, and we need to be prepared.
One of the things I'd like to mention is that the Coast Guard's National Strike Force is actually a national strike force that serves both the EPA Federal On-Scene Coordinators as well as the Coast Guard Federal On-Scene Coordinators who are responsible for the coastal spill. So one of the things that happens almost without thinking is that all of the experiences and lessons learned from that team are shared throughout the country. They are deployed from 3 different locations, and they work for both EPA and Coast Guard. So you've got some real synergies going back and forth, even though EPA's focus is inland and normally freshwater. There are, like you presumed, lessons learned. We do have some pipelines, some refineries, some chemical facilities in the coastal area that maybe are at lower numbers in terms of their numbers in the coastal zone. But when they have an incident, it quite often is a big incident, and we're glad to bring that knowledge and experience from the responses that our strike team has had working for EPA coordinators inland.
My office has responsibility not just in the marine environment, but also the inland environment. In California, we respond to petroleum oil spills in the inland environment. I could say without hesitation that we have more oil spills in the inland environment than we do in the marine environment. One of the difference normally is the marine environment is an open system, maybe much more difficult to corral than it is in the inland environment, but the sheer quantities and numbers of spills are much greater in the inland environment. As I addressed in the opening statement, booming systems for rapid, high-velocity areas like inland areas, rivers and streams, having things that are easily deployable is something I think we still need some work and research on. That certainly some of the research that's being looked at in updating Open 90 would help to address, I hope.
What I'd like is if, that's something that we may be able to explore, understanding that there may be many more inland incidents, but truly understanding when we talk about devastation, when it comes to quantities, how that may impact our oceans as well. Not to say that there's not devastation from one of these accidents occurring inland, and to make sure as well as we're looking at this and we lean from a technological perspective with arming our Coast Guard or first responders with the resources they need to adequately respond, that we look to some of our laboratories with some of their expertise as well in being able to not only model these situations, but in some of their homeland preparedness techniques, which may lend to some support in this specific area. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Woolsey, for bringing this forward.
Excellent point, Mr. Lujan. It was indeed 10 years ago that we had the terrible accident up in Bellingham. My colleague Rick Larson led the effort to fix that, and I will never forget the testimony of the families who lost children in that extraordinary explosion. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline ignited in one moment, and it devastated the community and killed 3 innocent people. And so it's a very, very good point that this is not just a marine thing that happens offshore. Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And H.R. 2693 is not just a marine bill. It's all, an oil spill is an oil spill is an oil spill, and prevention and cleanup all in both areas. Mr. Edinger, thank you for being a boots on the ground example to us. I mean, you're the great expert that we need to hear from because you were really right there. And you mentioned that the failure of containment booms when the currents exceed a certain speed, I think it's 3/4 of a knot, that this makes it really difficult, and particularly for protecting environmentally sensitive areas. So knowing that, and knowing that we need to do something about that, how do you go about, and who do you give your feedback to, and how does the process begin for you to get somebody to invent something that will work better?
Well, once again, Representative Woolsey, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here. And as a former resident of your district, I do appreciate all that you do.
It's a nice district, isn't it?
It is a great district. It is a great district. As far as there are incentives out there for the market environment, regarding what we do now in protecting areas where we don't have the right tools, we develop plans to use what is existing, what is out there right now. As example, the Costco Busan, we had difficulty with the Bolinas Lagoon, which I believe is in your district. Bolinas Lagoon is a high energy area. You have waves coming in, you have currents going up to 5, sometimes 6 knots. We end up having to very complex booming systems to try and keep oil out of that environment. But ultimately, that's very difficult. It's very difficult when you have limited resources as far as response capabilities. And quite frankly, often those technologies fail. There is a failure. As far as who it is that we try and get to create these new systems, unfortunately, we deal with what is in place. There is not a mechanism, certainly, for us to go out and say, here's a grant from the state of California to develop that. And really, we rely on the federal government and some of the research that goes on with the agencies that are here, also with the Minerals Management Service.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, because you are the 4 agents, including mineral management services, that my bill will be focusing on. What it does is it streamlines from 17 agencies to the 4 of you to ensure that we don't have this so dissipated that we don't get anything done. But you said that you had conference calls, Dr. Venosa. Do you have all 17 agencies on those conference calls, or is it the doers that are right here at the table?
It's mostly the doers. We have, gee whiz, probably half a dozen to 8 people who call in every month and talk about the research that we're doing. So it's certainly not all 14 or 16 agencies that are named in the bill.
So
Oil Pollution Act.
how do you get in touch with the universities that we can apply for these grants in my bill to do the research and build the booms or design somebody, I guess it'd be a mechanical engineering group or something, designing the booms we need. Who's talking to who? That's what I'm trying to get to right here.
Well, we do, the agencies do talk to each other. We do. I mean, like we say every month. NOAA does it a little bit differently from the way we do it. NOAA has their CRRC, and they have their annual peer review request for proposals. We also have a competitive contract that we have in Cincinnati with the university, and we do a lot of research with that university, both in-house among our own people, with people from the university who help us, as well as extramurally with that university.
And you're funding that project at the university?
Yes, the monies that EPA gets, we funnel. We compete some of it. Some of it goes to our LOE contract with that university, University of Cincinnati, and some of it we do ourselves in-house. We have in-house capabilities in not only our lab but other labs throughout the country.
And how do you get feedback on whether or not these programs are working once they're out in the field?
Well, everything that we do is peer reviewed, and we all attend the same conferences. The oil spill community, the research community, is very small. We all know each other, and we meet on some monthly basis, and we get together annually at various conferences. We know what's going on. We all know.
Well, so then how come we didn't have booms that would work in anything beyond 3/4 knots? I mean, that's pretty pretty still waters, isn't it, up until there?
Well, there are booms that have been developed by research and development for fast water, and there's also manuals that have been developed to give to the responders. And I guess the challenge is to having the right resources at the right place at the right time. And I don't know the specific circumstances of where these things were for the Costco Busan, but you know, the weather is something you can't predict. I guess there's a expectation for fog out there in the San Francisco Bay, obviously, and there's obviously rivers with a lot of potential for oil spills where you would pre-stage booms that are designed specifically for fast water recoveries. But sometimes you have a spill that occurs in low visibility that is in a place that usually has low visibility, or in fast water that maybe you were expecting a different type of a spill. We have to continue to get the mostly private response organizations, the oil spill response organizations, to produce and acquire the technologies that the R&D community develops.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Woolsey. Mr. Davis.
I watched and observed the Exxon Valdez spill, others that we've had in our country and along our streams. Observed at one time a small pond on a farm where domestic oil wells were being drilled and stored in a tank, and the tank erupted to a leak, went into the actual holding pond, and for somehow it leached down through the soil and got into some springs, and the pond ultimately had to be dammed off with roping that you used and eventually burned. So I'm somewhat aware as I look at the past and observe the damage that oil spills have had. And one of, I think, Dr. Venosa, if I'm saying that right? Venosa?
Venosa.
Venosa? Yeah. You have to forgive me, I'm from Tennessee, from the mountains of Tennessee, I guess some folks would say. But I know you made a comment that as we engage more in alternative fuels, perhaps maybe the piping underground of ethanol, that we could perhaps see more corrosion. I think that's a long way off, to be honest with you. We've got to grow an awful lot of switchgrass, and to get that much to where it would demand us maybe 10 or 15% of the usage to start putting pipes in. So I think our efforts to control spills that we may have from oil is perhaps our biggest challenge. If you were to compare the safety today of transporting oil, and we're using more and more, 8 billion barrels a year that we use in this country alone. But if you were to compare the safety record that we have today, either the four of you or all the four of you, compared to what we had a decade ago and 2 decades or 3 decades ago, how would you compare the safety records today? And do you think that we have adequate in place rules and regulations that would take us to the level of almost perfection in safety? Either one. What do we have to do to be sure we get to the point of where we have almost 100% certainty we don't have a spill?
I would say that the review of the data on the occurrence of spills there's been great success since the passage of OPA 90, and the reduction of spills has been significant. The problem is that spills, there's still that chance of a spill happening. We haven't safeguarded the system completely, so we still have to have preparedness, but overall, the system is much less oil is being spilled today than was being spilled in pre-OPA period.
Nothing is 100%. We'll never, ever be free of oil spills, or any kind of chemical spills for that matter. I mean, we can have the best technology in the world, and we probably do right now, with double-hulled vessels and all that kind of thing, but you're going to always have weather accidents that we can't, hurricanes, you know, the Murphy oil spill in Louisiana, that was caused by a level 5 hurricane. I mean, there's not much you can do about things like that. We can try to do the best science that we can, and we are doing the best science that we can right now. And I think we've, as Doug said, we have come a long way in improving our capabilities of responding to spills, but we'll never be 100% able to prevent them.
Anyone else?
Sir, I'd just like to comment because I've spent a large part of my career on the prevention side, which is the point of your question here, as opposed to the response side. And we have implemented regulations for double bottoms and electronic equipment to improve navigation. I mean, just on the ship construction side, I think we're to the point where accidents are typically caused by human factors, at least in ships navigating. There's probably some more work that could be done as far as engineering on some of the shore facilities that Dr. Venosa mentioned. But there is still work going on in that area. I can tell you, particularly in the area of human factors and regulation of vessels. For example, the Congress has authorized the Coast Guard to have an inspection regime for towing vessels. Most of the 7,000 towing vessels in this country are currently uninspected, and so we we were provided the resources just in this fiscal year to begin building an inspection program, and we hope to have the proposed rules out for that inspection regime very soon. And there are, there's other types of uninspected activities that I think we could address in the maritime, and yet I think we can look back with a great degree of satisfaction in how far we have come, just in my career. So it's never good to pat yourself on the back too much, but it's nice to take some credit.
I'd like to echo what Admiral Watson said, that we have come a long way. The number of spills along our coastline has gone down. The amount spilled has gone down. But I still think if we look at the Costco Busan as an example, that was a vessel vision, and we could look at the investigation and confirm that the bridge did not move. They alighted with a fixed object, which means that we will always have the potential for accidents where there's humans involved. As Dr. Venosa also mentioned, weather involved, large weather events will cause spills. So we will always have spills, unfortunately. The best thing we could do, though, is be as prepared as possible with the best technologies available.
And I asked the question for a reason. As you look at the huge increase in our imports, whether it be by land or pipe from Canada or Mexico, because a great percentage of our crude oil that's shipped into this country comes from this hemisphere, not, as some folks would believe, from the Middle East. It really comes from our hemisphere. But as you look at that large volume, I'm impressed that we haven't had much greater spills than we've had. Because not only are we importing 60-some% of the crude oil that we consume, that 60-something% is a huge number increase in barrels from the last 30 years of what we used to bring in. So I applaud the efforts of those of you that are today that have been involved in safety, those enforcement and others, and continue to do equal or better job. Thanks for being here today.
Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all your testimony. I just have one question, and I don't know a lot about this. I do recall visiting with my son on a vacation the site of the Exxon Valdez spill, and several years after the spill, and seeing the continued devastation. And so I'm curious about it. I wonder, Mr. Helton, in your testimony, you talked about the research gaps related to your ability to do effective modeling. And so I wonder if you could explore that with us just a little bit more, and particularly with respect to being able to simulate or use intelligent design to simulate different materials and quantities and densities, weather conditions, all of the factors that you talked about you describe in your testimony, and then your ability also to look at modeling in terms of impacts on ecosystems and communities. And I think it would be helpful for us if you were able to explore with a little bit more depth about where those research gaps are and what it is that this committee could consider to really fill them.
Thank you, Congresswoman Edwards. That's a very excellent question, because we struggle with modeling questions all the time. There's a number of kinds of models that we use in oil spill response and restoration. The ones that come to mind immediately are the models that we use to predict how the oil will behave once it's spilled in the water. The oil is going to move laterally with currents and winds. It's also going to move into the atmosphere through evaporation, and will also move into the water through dissolution and dispersion. Most of the models that we have focus on the surface layer, how the oil will move. We have less rigorous models predicting how the oil will move once it's dissolved into the water column. So that's an area of research, and we're trying to fill those gaps now. But there's a whole other suite of models that we use for biological effects, trying to figure out what's the effects on a salmon run or a shellfish population after it's been exposed to an insult from an oil spill. So Those, we have models that will help us predict the severity of exposure, the longevity of that exposure, but they could be much more rigorous. We use them in a predictive mode to help us understand how to respond and how to improve our responses, but we have a long way to go to be certain and confident in those. And you mentioned the Exxon Valdez, and the lingering oil question is still an issue 20 years later. And one of the questions is, how well can we model the oil once it's been entrained in those shoreline sediments and then being remobilized by storms and biotic activities? So that's an area of research. The models that we have to predict how oil moves on the sea surface are not well calibrated for Arctic spills. Once you throw in the variable of having broken ice conditions or even complete ice cover, we have little confidence in how that oil will behave and move because of that, the barrier that the floating ice causes.
Is that also true for modeling the rapid changes that we're seeing related to climate and your ability to model what would happen with the spill, you know, as we're in the throes of experiencing climate change?
Well, the climate change variable is a whole nother additional variable when we're trying to predict the effects of a biological impact on a resource. For example, take a salmon run in Alaska. It may be changing because of climate independent of a spill, and then adding a spill event on top of that creates a whole nother level of complexity that happen at very different timescales, because the spill is having effects on the days to months to years level, and the climate effects are years to decades level. So it's a very complicated additional scenario to consider.
And are there questions that you're asking now, say 20 years downstream, that's bad, no, anyway, 20 years down the line from the Exxon Valdez spill that should be instructive in terms of predicting the long-term impacts of an oil spill?
We try to learn from every spill we go to, and the Exxon Valdez has been fairly well studied in the long run. Several NOAA laboratories, EPA's done long-term research. The Exxon's done research on the Prince William Sound recovery as well. There's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of lack of consensus about how long it will take for that residual oil to resolve itself, and when the non-recovered resources will recover. And back to your previous question about climate change, one of the areas that we're particularly looking at that question is with very long-lived resources. Imagine a coral reef that's affected by an oil spill. So then you have very sensitive resources that are very sensitive to both oil and climate, and we know that they're already in decline because of climate impacts. So those would obviously be areas where those kinds of very sensitive resources would be the focus of additional research.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know we can't study everything, and so it sometimes helps to have kind of a priority list of those things that need to be put at the top. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I have just a few follow-up questions, and we may then, if Ms. Woolsey has any, we may finish with that. Ms. Woolsey, I would suggest I was looking again at the text of the bill, and I think it's an outstanding bill. As I heard Mr. Edinger and the others, I still am concerned about this gap of where funding comes from to develop the real-world materials needed to deal with different situations. Rather shocking, really. I mean, if I look at the waterways I'm familiar with, there's not many waterways that have less than 1 knot current. You look at the Puget Sound, the narrows of the Puget Sound is nearly 8 knot current at times in high ebb, and most rivers are going to have easily 1 knot current. And so the reason I say that is if one of our best available technologies in booming is not able to meet the most likely scenarios that it's maybe to encounter, one says, why hasn't something better been done? And Ms. Woolsey, I would suggest that there might be some merit to including economic research in the list of topics. And the economic research I would suggest is worth considering is this. My hunch is the way many companies deal with the risk of oil spill is through insurance. And they deal with it insurance, and they basically buy off the risk. But buying off the risk probably doesn't incentivize the creation of new technologies to actually reduce the impact of the risk. And unless, I mean, it's somebody be smart enough to do the calculus, say what's the probability, it's low, of an incident, what's the cost relative to the cost of insurance, et cetera, and then, so where's the financial incentive? I'm not saying you should impose some draconian penalty structure, but my guess would be that if that is in fact how risk is capitalized, you're not going to have incentive to actually create the new tools, because there's going to be R&D costs, manufacturing costs, a low probability of use, et cetera, et cetera. And so you may want to look at just a sort of regulatory economic structure that actually may impede rather than enhance development of this. Another thing that strikes me.
If the gentleman will yield.
Please, I'd be happy to.
Then when we have a hearing, I mean, have a markup, we can add that in as an.
I think, and if folks have some suggestions for that, I'd sure welcome that, because my hunch is that's part of what's going on here. You know, if somebody said, gosh, I've got a great idea for a piece of equipment to contain or recover oil from oil spills, I'd be interested in the economics of whether it makes sense to produce that. Maybe it's there, I don't know. You know, and given that we're apparently better at reducing the frequency of them, that makes the economics somewhat, paradoxically, less beneficial. I'm also struck by Admiral Watson, the chart I think provided with your testimony. As I look at that chart, the major spills over in 05 and 06, I can't tell necessarily from 04, it's on page 5, came actually from ground sources. And we tend to think of Exxon Valdez, Costco, and much of our discussion today has been focused on that. But if we look at, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this, net volume by source in the given years, they came from, you look at the Hurricane Katrina damages, people often say, oh, there were no oil spills in Katrina. There's a heck of a lot of oil spill related to Katrina. But as I read it, I may be wrong here, much of that came from damages to oil storage facilities and a barge that ran aground on a devastated, wrecked platform. But the bulk of that graph is oil storage facilities. In 06, 1.6 million gallons from damaged refinery stormwater setting tank, again during a severe storm. Now my question is, so much of our discussion, and I think frankly so much of OPA 90 was focused on at-sea spills. Maybe we ought to ask ourselves, to what extent is, if this is the case, and following up on Ms. Edwards' observation, to what extent should our research be dedicated to is our research focus proportionate to the actual causes, at least as observed in recent years? Does anyone care to comment on that?
Yes, sir. I'll just comment briefly, and then maybe Dr. Venosa. But yeah, what you're seeing here are large storage tanks that are affected by large storms. I think, you know, one of the, I mean, obviously huge amounts of oil is lost in one of these incidents, but there are berms around these facilities, and I mean, there are regulations for this situation that mitigate even worse damage to the environment. And
unless the flood overtakes the berm.
Well, and that has happened. Yeah. Yes, sir. So you know, it's a tough problem. Do you invest a huge amount of money to make a storage tank hurricane proof?
If you build it in hurricanes.
Right. Maybe that's what you have to do. Or do you you invest more in the berming system and in the consequence management side? So. Yeah,
I just think we want to look at that, and that relates also to Mr. Lujan's earlier question about non-maritime related events. So I just put that out there to as grist for the mill. The final thing I want to just address, as my colleagues know, I'm very passionate about what's happening to our oceans and corals especially, and it's my understanding that if, for example, you were to use dispersants, you could actually kill the coral, that the dispersants kill the coral. And so there's a generic question of, are we spending enough attention on issues of coral type environments and the impact of spills and the remediation of spills And also, to what extent is this worldwide? Is this knowledge and technology disseminated worldwide? If you look at the Coral Triangle and, for example, to what extent do we know what we're doing when we're dealing with spills in the coral reefs areas, and to what extent does the rest of the world know and have the technology to deal with that?
Well, the subject of coral and oil spills could be a whole hearing in itself. It's something that NOAA's paid a lot of attention to, and we have a coral reef conservation program. One of the things that program helped fund was was oil spill response guidelines for coral environments, and we'd be happy to provide a copy of that manual to the committee. It is a very complicated issue. We know that dispersants can sometimes cause more harm than good, and evaluating what those trade-offs are is a major part of the research that we've been trying to move forward on. The idea of sharing that technology, the coral guidebook that we prepared on oil spills was specifically translated into Spanish to be available for the Caribbean region. I'm not aware of it being shared beyond that, but it's certainly available for that kind of use.
Thank you. One final comment I'll make and then recognize Mr. Inglis if he has comments. My understanding is the Coast Guard spent about $20 million over the past 10 years on oil spill R&D. EPA spent $720,000 last year, I believe, and NOAA doesn't really have a line for this. Is that a correct understanding?
That's correct. NOAA doesn't get a direct appropriation for oil spill R&D. We use base funds. Unlike some of the other agencies, we don't have a line from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. And as a point, I think the Interagency Coordinating Committee is a coordinator of research, but the committee itself doesn't control any funds. Any research priorities that they identify are then the responsibility of the individual agencies that have that authority and funding to move forward.
Reminds me of the lesson I was taught as a little child. You clean up your mess, but in this case, nobody's paying for the broom. Mr. Inglis.
I wonder if there have been any spin-off technologies here from the work that we've been doing into other kinds of applications. So, for example, when drilling for geothermal resources resulted in better drilling techniques for the oil industry. I wonder if do you know of any spin-offs that have occurred here where other applications have been found from the technology that we're trying to develop to control oil and water? No.
I think that we've borrowed technologies from other industries. I'm not aware of any other industries borrowing our technologies. Is that the question?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that was sort of the question. I got to tell you, what the chairman said, better salad dressing could be part of what comes out of this. Is keeping things mixed, I guess, oil and water mixed, or
I was just
unmixing them.
Just passed a note that the medical community uses some of the sorbent technology. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah. How about one other thing for the Admiral is do you own or have control over unmanned vehicles, reconnaissance vehicles, or if you needed one, where would you go to get it? Everybody always wants their own, of course, and maybe you have your own, but if you don't have your own, can you go get them somewhere else?
Yes, sir. We of course, are a member of the Armed Services, so we're working very closely with the Air Force and the Northern Command for Homeland Security, and then we are very involved with the project that the Border Customs and Border Protection have. They owned a Predator, and they've been testing those for the border, and we are working on a Marinize, which means for the maritime environment version of that. So I don't know exactly where this R&D acquisition plan is going to end up, but my guess is that there'll be a cross use of these assets. And you know, just almost going back to your last question, I can't answer exactly how oil spill stuff has been used elsewhere, but I can tell you that a lot of the tools that we've developed for the various Coast Guard missions, whether it's search and rescue or whether it's homeland security or whether it's fisheries patrols, oftentimes are handy in an oil spill event as well. That some of the surveillance equipment you mentioned, unmanned aerial surveillance vehicles, these are things that will be able to carry any sort of sensor equipment that can fit in there. And when we develop these things, we will, as we have for the last 2 decades, equip them to be able to be used in an oil spill or a chemical incident as well.
That's helpful, because, you know, I'm aware of a municipality that wanted basically an armored personnel carrier, and they got it from Homeland Security, a Homeland Security grant. I was asking them, well, why don't we just call up the National Guard that has those assets? Can't ever reach them, was the answer. And I said, well, maybe we could buy them a cell phone, and then you could have 2 cell phones, 2 red cell phones. And if you ever need one of those armored personnel carriers in this city in South Carolina, perhaps we could use the red phones to call rather than having a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment now that we've paid for. So we've got 2 within 2 miles of each other. You know, so I hope that when we do this sort of thing with, you know, figuring out how to track this oil, that we really can move assets seamlessly from the Air Force to the Coast Guard to get them assigned to a spill quickly. A bunch of red cell phones might be a good idea, you know, so we can make sure that we can get those deployed. But really, it is something to seriously look into, is quickly deploying those assets so that we don't have, you know, this Tora situation of waiting for the drone to come over and find where it's gone because we can't get the asset there. Could become a very frustrating and damaging situation. So it sounds like a good protocol to work on. What do you think? But making sure it can be deployed quickly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Woolsey, we have about 11 minutes, 50 seconds till the vote, so you recognize.
Right, and we know that it's going to be about 25 minutes before that vote is over.
Oh, remember, we changed that policy.
Oh, no,
yeah.
but we didn't.
Discussions.
All right. Mr. Helton, you mentioned something about when we were talking, when you were in your testimony about depending on how well local communities engage, and I believe engage in the cleanup and the response and all of that. I can tell you that during the Costco Busan cleanup, my constituents were really frustrated. We had armies of volunteers that wanted to be down there on the beach, cleaning up, cleaning the fowl that were coming in, you know, trying to save their lives and all that. And they were turned back because they weren't trained. And they, so first of all, I need you to tell me what you meant by how well the communities engage. But there's something in my legislation that says extra mural, how do you say that? Extramural grants, and it includes detecting or mitigating oil discharges. Would mitigating, by helping volunteers, keeping them prepared and trained, would that be helpful in the mitigation of these disasters? Do you see it as that, or what did you mean by that?
I had a very broad statement about engagement of local communities before, during, and after spills that would include the example that you raised of volunteers. What I was thinking of when I was drafting the testimony was the broader experiences from large spills like the Exxon Valdez, where some communities after the spill suffered very substantial social disruption from the influx of the response, as well as the damage, the loss of their fisheries, loss of income. So especially in rural subsistence communities, a spill can have very significant impacts to their economy and social structure. And as a city like San Francisco, I don't think that it had that kind of impact, but it certainly had a social impact in essentially a double tragedy, because people felt strongly about trying to prevent the spill and clean up the spill, and then being denied the ability to help out. They were essentially injured twice. And so, I'm sure your office received thousands of calls from citizens about that.
Yes, indeed.
There is an effort through the National Response Committee to address how volunteers can be better used. There are a number of concerns about management of a cadre of volunteers that might change on a daily basis. So we don't want to take away resources from the response to train 1,000 people one day and then have a different 1,000 people the next day that have to be trained. But that is a major focus of an NRT committee this year, and perhaps the Coast Guard could address that.
Okay. Admiral Watson?
That is a function of an oil spill response quite often, is that you need to have some capacity to provide training. And as Mr. Helton said, it's particularly an issue when you have people whose subsistence depend on the water that's been affected. That's been something I've been involved with personally up in northern Washington coast, where the Makah Indian tribe was affected by a significant oil spill. And the national response team is working on that issue. I think that was one of the lessons learned from the Costco Busan spill. And it's going to have to be something that is really implemented at the local level.
Right.
But the guidelines and the targets for what we want to achieve in the long run will be established at the national level by the national response team.
Right. Thank you for reminding me. The fishermen were out there in their boats. I mean, they would have done anything to help, and realized they didn't have permission and didn't quite know what they were supposed to do. Mr. Edinger.
You brought up a great point about the Costco Busan. The need for volunteers, never before have we had volunteers that wanted to actually go up and clean oil up on California's beaches. We've seen people that will swim through oil to save wildlife, but we've never seen people that are willing to go out and actually clean up oil themselves. So we've changed things. With the U.S. Coast Guard, we've changed the area contingency plan in the San Francisco Bay to address that. But kind of overarching also was the problem that we had on the Costco Busan was never getting in front of the story. The public was looking at that. It was a Veterans Day weekend. They were looking at the oil on the beaches, and they never really understood what was going on with the beaches. We never got in front of the story to say, our efforts right now are on the water efforts to get the oil off of the water as soon as possible. And the sandy beaches where the oil was being deposited, that's actually a place where we could deal with it much better than anywhere else. So we were going through a progression in our spill response, but we never got that message out. We've developed tools, websites, used social media to get the message out for the next spill. Once again, we've also worked with the local volunteer centers to make sure that we have a mechanism in place to engage them should one of these events occur in the future.
So I believe that the people in that area would be willing to be certified, take training, even though they don't expect there ever to be another spill, just in case, so they'd be prepared before the spill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for this hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Woolsey, for introducing the legislation, and thanks to our witnesses and all the others who've participated today. I thank my colleague, Mr. Inglis, for his insightful questions. And with that, the hearing stands adjourned. Thank you very much. Enjoy the day. Customarily, the record will be held open for 2 weeks for anyone wishing to offer additional comments or material.